And we're recording. We're here with Philip Bredau, Zoomer Schopenhauer. How are you doing, my friend?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I am downcast though because I've heard that the dastardly Labor Party is banning our bacon, smoky bacon crisps. Have you heard about this? The downfall of British civilization.
Yeah,
Um,
no, we're harmonizing with EU rules. They're gonna have to change the recipe up. Nigel Farage is not happy about it.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine, I don't know if they're anything like bacon bits in America, but a lot of these things have these weird ingredients that,
Yeah.
they do things, they extend the shelf life, 25%, or they, make it cheaper or whatever. But the effects on human health are, um, concerning. And
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing because like you take something like alcohol, which Europeans have been drinking alcohol for 10,000 years or something. Um, and you've got like Scottish people are one of the best adapted populations in the world to alcohol consumption. And so, Scottish people can hold their liquor quite well. But, you take Native Americans who really didn't have that experience, almost like a Darwinian process of just getting people drunk and then people dying of liver cirrhosis and then sort of surviving that process. But I sort of think of a lot of these additives as, we're adding in these things that maybe aren't as intense as alcohol, but you kind of add them all in combination, you add them together. And I imagine that there are health impacts that are some of them are difficult to measure. I know RFK has kind of been symbolic of like banning the food dyes and things
Hmm.
like that. And I think that's sort of how I want to segue into this question of Malthusianism, because I think the fundamental resource that we have to that is depleting or that is threatened and that we should be concerned about is human health and human intelligence, which are not really separable. Because I have a holistic view. If your health is terrible, then that's going to impact your intelligence. Um, and I don't think people take that seriously enough in general. And you're have been talking a lot about Malthusianism from a maybe more classical perspective of there are these material resources, we're running out of them, and this is not sustainable, and the kind of infinite growth model is going to come crashing down. So that's maybe my perspective and your perspective certainly differ, but I'm open to hearing your side of the story and kind of this work in progress you've been
Yeah.
developing these thoughts. So kind of respond to that and lay out the case for what is the concern and what are people not aware of.
Well, I mean, if you go back to Malthus himself, his basic concern was that human populations' growth is geometric, whereas he said basically food output, agriculture is arithmetic. So they don't have the same kind of growth curves. That human population growth is exponential, and that's not the same for agriculture. And you go backwards in time from Malthus, and particularly when you add in David Ricardo, the diminishing marginal gains from labor. So labor, you add labor, then you'll get more productivity, but at a certain point that tips off, and then you'll get inflation as a function of having excess population pressure. And you go backwards from 1798, and you see that in agrarian civilization, going back 10,000 years, you just have these cyclical patterns over and over again of like, I mean, like Plato talks about like soil degradation, and we have just many cases of cycles of overpopulation, which then results in the negative feedback loops of nature coming in. Like, for example, people say that the Black Death is not really an example of this, but to me, Eurasia, even at this point, was a kind of superorganism. It was linked via various trade routes. And the overpopulation in both Europe and Asia led to material conditions where the plague was far more likely to spread than at other equivalent times. You'd seen famines in 1315 to 17. You have lots of contemporary accounts about overpopulation. And also, you track population with prices, and it's a better predictor than monetarism, than, in a sense, debasement of currencies, is you look at the population pressure and you have a very closely related graphs. However, this kind of breaks down after the mid-19th century because you have massive technological innovation in modernity. And so I'd already kind of known that Malthus looks quite good when you look backwards from Malthus, but it doesn't look so good afterwards. And so the question is, well, what did he get wrong? And he did get something wrong. But what he got wrong isn't the kind of libertarian myth that we have infinite supply of everything, that we live in a cornucopia, that there's no such thing as limits. It's that you can get a massive energy surplus, which can then massively, exponentially boost the productivity of agriculture and all sorts of other things. But that you can have this kind of lag effect between cause and effect. You can have a huge lag between when you've exceeded the carrying capacity of a land area and then the consequences which come later. And that's what William Catton in his 1980 classic work, Overshoot, talks about, because the present is based off of the drawing down of resources, which enable prosperity now, but we have gone above a limit because you're not living sustainably if what you're doing now depends on the depletion of resources. But it's more sophisticated than that because he has access to modern ecology. So it's that what we're doing as a modern civilization goes above the regenerative capacity of resources, say oil, which is produced over millions of years in geological timeframes and is being consumed 10 million times faster than it was ever produced. So that's the drawdown. You're doing things faster than they regenerate. That's one of the problems of modern techno-industrial civilization. The second is the waste, because modern civilization has a metabolism, and the laws of thermodynamics dictate that entropy always goes up. So there's a massive waste product, the biggest waste product of which is carbon, but there's tons of other things which we dump into our ecosystem, which it goes beyond nature's assimilative capacities. And so that's why you have global heating. That's why you have PFAS pollution from plastics. That's why you have soil degradation and the depletion of aquifers. There's just tons of different ecological effects of going above what nature can assimilate. And what I would say is that you're concerned about, health. I mean, certainly 1 in 7 globally women have fertility issues. 1 in 7 couples straight up have fertility issues today, and that is a result of primarily of plastics, which affect us in a whole number of different ways. And it is well known, the effects of plastics, but it's not so easy to do experiments because, in a sense, everybody is exposed. I mean, there's like the fish, or there's microplastics in the fish at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, right? Like, there is nobody who is immune, and so you can't do a double-blind study with a control group that's not exposed on what it is. But this affects mammals. It affects us. I think that intelligence. I mean, there's other factors which are leading to potential declines of intelligence on a global scale, which aren't related to Overshoot, which have a whole number of different complex reasons for the global demography going the way it has. But yeah, I mean, I would say that Malthusianism is still relevant today. I would say that the one thing which Malthus did not see coming straight up as well was birth rate decline, because he just thought that humanity was just overwhelmingly sexual and we would never be able to restrain ourselves from mating like rabbits. But actually, that has happened in a number of advanced societies. I still think that it's relevant to have Malthus in mind, though, because the decay rate of going below replacement level is an exponential decay rate. It's not a linear decay. And so if you take South Korea or Taiwan or China, you're talking about like massive drop-offs generation to the next one and so forth. So that's you know, the non-linearity is still, you have to keep that in mind when you are forecasting into the future, because it makes an enormous difference.
When you say there's massive drop-offs, I mean, are you saying because at first I hear what you're saying is, you know, we're consuming too much, and
Yeah.
I guess there's a couple of different approaches to that. And the first problem I guess I have is this question of globalism and
Mm-hmm.
nationalism. Is that you know, let's say the United Kingdom or Germany, you know, has kind of in fact led the way, I think, or the Netherlands. You know, banning fertilizers or you know, banning nuclear, and whatever we think about, you know, the effects of that, like there is some kind of ideological movement, whether it's making the right decisions or not. I'm just saying that, you know, there are these countries that theoretically are taking these steps to say, okay, well, we need sustainability, and this is how we're going to do it. But, you know, if Germany isn't consuming as much, or the Netherlands isn't, you know, using as much fertilizer, but then every other country in the world is doing so, then it kind of doesn't matter. So if
Mm.
it is a global problem, then it's hard to imagine, especially with things like immigration. It's hard to imagine, I guess, if there's like a plague of locusts of human overconsumption in one area of the globe, and then you try to sequester your area of the globe to be all nice and sustainable. Um, I don't know. It seems like uh, there's an inevitability of, if you don't solve the problem. I mean, you know, global warming as an example, it's not a local problem. It's a, you know, just because
Yeah.
China produces the CO2 over there, but it's not going to affect us over here. It doesn't work that way. So
No.
politically speaking, then is this a hopeless thing, or, you know,
Well, I mean, in a sense, this gets to the heart of the issue, because nobody like sat down and decided to like create modernity with its mass metabolism. Nobody decided to sit down and agree to PFAS pollution or global warming or any of these things and said this is a great thing which we should be optimizing towards. It's the result of a whole bunch of multiple organizations which have very narrow optimization strategies, like their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders or geopolitical competition. They're much more narrow focused goals where, in a sense, you are sacrificing ecological sustainability, or you're kind of ignoring the kind of physical limitations on what you're doing because, well, if we dropped out of the game, then our enemies or the other companies would be doing things more cheaply than us. Our geopolitical enemies would be, making mincemeat of us, and so forth. And so everyone is kind of locked in, and therefore we get this result where we do things which actually nobody actually wants to happen, and that's kind of why it's a predicament rather than a problem, in the sense of like it's just the condition which we are in. And that's why I'm not a degrowther, because I don't think it's possible to voluntarily get people to do any of this stuff. But nonetheless, I think that it is important to understand the predicament that we are in. I mean, I think that we will reach a post-growth period this century because, in a sense, the actual physical forces of degrowth will become stronger and stronger over time as it becomes more and more expensive to engage in the kind of mining that's necessary to, say, scale up green energy, because you'd have to massively scale that up. And that would get much more expensive before you even hit things like peak copper or peak cobalt or peak neodymium or whatever. I mean, in order to replace a fleet of like 1.4 billion vehicles, with electric alternatives, and never mind the fact that all of these energies are much less power dense and they're much less efficient. It's just not possible to replace what we currently have with an electrical alternative at the same scale. And so I think that we will be hitting these kind of physical boundaries. And it's kind of a tortoise and the hare situation, because you can have some innovations, you can have ways of delaying this, but I don't think that you can actually delay these things indefinitely. There are hard physical limits here, especially because economic growth is exponential. And what that means is that, for example, we've consumed more oil after 1995 than before 1995, because with each doubling, because if something is at an exponential rate, then you have something called the rule of 70. So 70 divided by whatever the rate is. So if you're growing 3% a year, then it would be 70 divided by 3. So it'd be, the whole economy would double every 23 years. And because the economy is tied to material consumption at basically a rate of 1-to-1, that means that you've consumed more materials over that increment, that doubling, than all of previous history combined. And that's what the current system is premised upon. I mean, you listen to politicians in this country, and if you're not getting that kind of like 2%, 3% growth every year, then it's like a panic, it's a disaster. But of course, this thing which we're optimizing for is a self-terminating goal. It is a narrow goal which results in catastrophe if you were to actually just continue doing it. And so in a sense, how this pans out, it probably, the solution would be some kind of planetary world government that dictated to everybody what they were going to do. But of course, that's the thing about globalism, is globalism has defeated the nation states. There is no country in the world which doesn't rely on a 6-continent supply chain. Because say, if you look at America, if you look at Japan or you look at Germany or Britain, it's like absolutely hopeless. If you look at something like America or China, they seem like better contenders for real nation states, but not really. They're still absolutely dependent on globalism. I mean, China imports more oil than anyone else. They are dependent on selling things to world markets, and they are very much dependent on a global system. And America is actually not energy independent, and it's very finance based. It doesn't have that kind of industrial independence which China has. So it's kind of an opposite situation. But no, neither of them are there. And then obviously you look at anyone else, and they're much further from either of those two to be meaningfully independent. So everyone depends on globalism, but at the same time, there is no global institution which actually has the ability to meaningfully dictate to national level governments what they're going to do. And because of that, it's pretty much impossible to get an actual meaningful agreement on anything with respect to ecology. You've had so many kind of climate meetings for the last 50 years, and none of them have really made an impact in terms of the material throughput growth. From 1970, it was 22 billion tons of materials that were used, extracted, 70 billion by 2010. That's more than a 3-fold increase. I mean, it hasn't really done anything. I don't think it really can do anything, and so that's the real problem. Is that globalism it has overwhelmed nations, but also it's not actually strong enough to overrule them either. So I think that again, I can't offer a solution here. I'm just laying out a predicament which doesn't offer any obvious solution, really.
Yeah, regarding this question of mining, so I mean that seems to me like a fairly difficult problem to solve. Some of the other things like soil degradation, I mean, theoretically you can rotate your crops, or
Yeah.
one of the things about soil degradation actually that I'm interested in is the use of sewage, because it's what the soil needs is, it needs organic matter, it needs carbon, and we dump, especially India and Africa, they dump a ton of their sewage into the ocean. Even in America, we dump coastal cities dump sewage into the ocean. They treat it and then they dump it. This doesn't it doesn't make the beaches smell very nice, and it
Yeah.
creates the bacterial infections in the ocean. But you could theoretically process that sewage, and then you could, you know, transport it to farms, and you could basically create soil out of it. And we don't really have a shortage of sewage, so that could be done. It would require a kind of a revolution in how we deal and treat sewage, which would be
Yeah,
expensive. But
I mean, regenerative agriculture is not some kind of ancient thing. I mean, we had gotten very good at optimizing it by the 1890s, which is well into the industrial period. I mean, the actual reason why you saw the end of mass starvation as a cyclical event in Europe was really just Russian and American colonialism. I mean, they had expanded into the like Midwest and the West, and there was straight up new mass agriculture there, which hadn't existed previously. Same thing with Russia, and so Russian and American grain could be then brought in using steamships and so forth. No, I mean, really, it's the 20th century where you see gigantic revolutions in agriculture. But the point is that if you didn't have fertilizer, like and you couldn't intensively use fertilizer, you more or less would have had a population capped at. Yeah, so regenerative agriculture, it's something that we know how to do it. It's just something that we don't do. It's actually a good example of, well, in a sense, we ignore both the natural nitrogen cycles of the soil and the natural water cycles, hydrocycles of the soil, and we bypass that. And we, in order to just constantly have fertilized soil, which we artificially put in using very, very energy intensive means to do so, the Haber-Bosch process, which involves very, very high industrial heat temperatures to make ammonia. It's if you didn't have that, you'd be capped at about 2 billion people, most likely, which is why Václav Smil calls fertilizer one of the four pillars of contemporary civilization. And it depends on the drawdown of natural gas, which we probably won't have by the ending of this century. But yes, I mean, I think that there are practical solutions. It's just that the problem is that they're not necessarily growther solutions. You know, it's very, very difficult to replicate anything at the scale of population and consumption which we have without the fossil carbon substitutes. Yeah, that's an intractable problem. If you are committed to the exponential growth forever, Julian Simon, you know, abundance, Richard Helania paradise.
well, I guess the thing I have about abundance is they don't really talk about. I mean, maybe they have something about fossil fuels about how we should, we should use more fossil fuels or something. But I actually don't think, from my perspective, the idea that there's on the one side the green energy, which is sustainable, and the other side there's the
Mm.
hydrocarbons, which is unsustainable. I see that as a false dichotomy because of what
Yes.
we're talking about with mining. I'd actually rather we use, uh, the hydrocarbons that we have and not, subsidize these the green energy because it's and I'm not saying it's useless or something like that, but I think um, it's almost the reverse of what we're talking about, right? Where it's like ideally you would have a government that would come in and say, okay, well, we've got soil degradation. It's a long-term problem.
Yeah.
What we need to do is we need to, come in here and sort of create some regulations or something where we're going to have regenerative agriculture. With green energy, it has all of that ideology behind it, but the actual material effects of blowing up mountains to get more lithium, to build more
Mm.
batteries, to put in more, solar panels and things like that. The actual practical effect is, none of that is really much more sustainable than what we're doing with hydrocarbons. So, on that point, I don't really have a problem with the abundance agenda. And also in terms of like zoning laws and urbanism, I think that from my perspective, and we might be able to, you might be able to say something on this. Urban density, if you want a sustainable ecology, then you want people living in cities, because when people live in cities, they use less energy for transportation because you can just walk to your, use public transportation as opposed to a car. The most energy intensive form of economy is the suburban commuter who lives in the suburb and then drives 30 minutes into the city and then drives back. So that suburban sprawl that you see in American cities is coming to Europe as well. I think
Mm.
that is, in terms of the idea that there is a problem with energy consumption. That seems to me to be a terrible model of economy, whereas the abundance people are saying, hey, let's get rid of all the zoning regulations and pack everybody in here like sardines and lower the price of urban housing so everyone can move into
Mhm.
cities, versus what has been happening, which is everyone's fleeing the cities because the pricing's out of control, because the zoning's out of control, because of the boomers who want to preserve their real estate equity.
Yeah.
So I actually don't have a problem with that agenda, even from maybe
Yeah,
a
I mean,
Malthusian perspective.
I think that people kind of delude themselves to an extent about this point because, I mean, think of it this way: like, you pack together a bunch of um, cows into a cattle grid to be fed, um, and well, how much land do you need to grow all of the crops for the feedstock that you give them? And that's the actual amount of land needed for the cattle grid. And so the point with a city is I don't think there's actually that much of a difference between suburban sprawl and and a densely packed city, because if you have an enormously populated city, you need an absolutely vast supply chain of mining, energy, and resources to transport everything related to this city. A city is absolutely enormous if you take into account its ecological footprint. Um, well, I think that my opposition to suburban sprawl more comes from the European distaste towards it. I mean, you think of any great city, you think of a well-designed, packed urban area like Prague or Venice or whatever. Nobody is thinking of like a cozy suburban sprawl Americana outside, like, like nobody thinks of that when they think of a good city. I think that it's just it was just this weird post World War II urban planning decision that was retarded.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not retardation. I think it's desegregation and civil
Well, yeah.
rights that inspired white flight. Now, in Europe, maybe there's some different incentives going on, maybe some of the same incentives, but I think that the boomer equity liquidity trap, where they realize that, okay, if I just hold on to my house, it will increase in value, and if we can artificially constrict the housing supply, then the housing value will go up even further. So there's some perverse incentives there
That's
for.
true. Although I think that you don't actually necessarily get rid of perverse market incentives in housing if you have a fucking giga supply of them. Like there's a massive amount of speculation in the Chinese housing market, which leads to price bubbles, even though they have this ludicrous amount of housing that they build. Um, for example.
Well, yeah, the problem with the Chinese housing market, and they've basically just had their 2008 moment with their housing,
Yes.
where they've basically bailed out all of these, their equivalent of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. They've just bailed that out to the tunes of however many billions, we don't know. But
Yeah.
they're currently doing that, which is going to lead to some weird, because they manipulate their currency, so they're not going to have the same effects that we would have in America, but there are going to be consequences to that. And the
Yes.
reason why they have that particular problem is because they said, well, what are we good at? We're good at building things. And what are people allowed to invest in? They're allowed to invest in real estate. You're not,
Yeah.
the stock market in China is not the same thing as the stock market in America. So
No.
if people want to build wealth, they buy second and third houses, and you're building all these empty houses that no one lives in. And then at some point, people realize, oh, everybody has a second and third house, and nobody lives in them, and the value crashes, and it's creating some
Yeah.
havoc over there. So that's almost that's almost the complete opposite problem that we have in America. Still a problem, right? So I think both of those policies are bad. I think both having, we have this 30-year mortgage thing in America, plus zoning laws that advantage people who are already homeowners, whereas in China,
Yeah.
it's like the government is subsidizing the building of new construction, and they're overshooting with that, right? So both of those policies are, I think that there's this term abundance is now meaning everything to everyone, where you have like the socialist candidate in New York is saying, well, I believe in abundance because I think we should just build a bunch of public housing and freeze
Right.
the rent and things. It's like, okay, well, this is just a meaningless term right now. It has nothing to do with Ezra Klein. But whatever. I mean, semantics aside, I going back to this point about urban development and planning, when I did my study of civil rights and what is the
Mhm.
cost, I found that about 35% of the 21% of GDP, so that's what, 8% of GDP,
Mhm.
it's transportation costs. And this is the way that I calculate that is I'm not just calculating the gallons of gasoline, which are significant in themselves. I'm also
Mhm.
counting the transportation time. I'm also counting the damage to the roads. I'm also counting environmental costs. So when you add all of that up, actually, it is a significant proportion of the economy to have people living in suburbs and commuting to cities.
Yeah, I'm
Plus,
sure it
we
is.
have to manufacture all these cars, right? Where people wouldn't have to own those cars because they'd use public transportation. So I think it is significant. I mean, you're absolutely correct that a city can't survive without farms and mines and all of those other things. So in that sense, yes, cities and suburbs, when you subtract the problem of transportation, are basically identical. But I think that's significant. Um,
Oh
it
no, I mean economically that's very significant. But I think some people try and act like have this contrarian take where they're like, well, the psychology of someone who lives in suburbia is that they're in like a nice, environmentally friendly place, but they're really not. The whole thing is kind of stupid. Um, and then you can have this brilliant contrarian smug smile when you say, well, actually, it's being packed like sardines is better. It's like, well, really, it's from a purely economic point of view, I absolutely understand the anti-suburban and I endorse it position. I'd much rather have nice urbanism than it. But like from an ecological point of view, you're basically making a very, very similar impact. And really, it's the scale of consumption and population, which, I mean, this is pretty much details on the margin when it comes to that problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think 8% is significant in when
Yeah, no, it's not nothing.
we're talking about the 3% growth. I mean, in with respect to that, but beyond that, right? So the fundamental issue that we're talking about is having 10 billion people versus 2 billion people, right? 2 billion is
Yeah,
sustainable, 10 billion is not, according to your
indeed.
projections. And so if you want to achieve that 2 billion as quickly as possible, I think urbanism has shown, and this is true in South Korea, it's true in Europe, it's true in Kenya, it's true in America, that urban density decreases fertility. So that would be another argument in favor of packing people in like sardines, is because Malthus, talking about he didn't understand, or he thought human sexuality was unbounded.
That's
Um,
actually one thing which is not actually also true going backwards. The I mean, in France, in the early to mid 17th century, and you went to a peasant village, it would be deeply overpopulated. Um, all of the estates would have been split into just nothing, just tiny, tiny parcels, which were not self-sufficient. Um, and if you would have been like, and so you'd go to these places, and the lowest peasants on the rung, hundreds and hundreds of thousands every year, would just straight up never have sex whatsoever, because there wasn't really any effective contraception, and they knew that their children would just be born into a life of absolutely abject poverty. And so you actually had a remarkably chaste peasantry, which is very difficult to conceptualize. But when you have a downwardly mobile whole social order, then that can actually happen. So I'm not as surprised about these kind of fertility drop-offs in modernity, because you can have these effects. You have actually had these effects in pre-modern times. Whether or not you want to call mid 17th century pre-modern or not, I don't know. But yes, it can happen.
well, let's get into modernity. I mean, so this what I'm concerned about when I talk to people who are pro technology, and I mean, I would describe myself as pro technology, but maybe we'll call them the techno optimists, people who say,
Yes.
you're talking about this Malthusianism, but you have to sort of trust the plan, and
Mhm.
technology is going to come along, and these predicaments are solvable,
Yes.
because AI is just so good, and whatever, the solar panels are getting cheaper every year, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And my problem with that, or my skepticism, I mean, I want to believe in that, but where I start asking questions is to say, okay, we've had this however, I mean, you can say industrial revolution, but I really think it
Mhm.
starts in the medieval era, that you had this period of dark ages, and in the 12th century Europe exceeded the population under Rome. So by
Mhm.
that time in the 12th century, Europe was already more developed, it already had more economic growth. And so you could say, really, for the last 800 years, Europe, and by extension Russia and America, have had this almost uninterrupted 800 years of technological growth.
Um,
It
no, I
wasn't.
would not. I would.
Go
I
ahead.
don't
Go
agree
ahead.
with
Yeah,
that.
give me your thoughts on that.
I mean, yeah, in the 12th century, I mean, in the 14th century, things were absolutely down the gutter. I mean, a third of all people from India to Iceland died, including like over half the population of Europe. Um, and then, I mean, in the 17th century, you then also had a very, very protracted crisis, which was very much, it led to a sort of stagnation. I mean, in some places like Germany during the 80 years, 30 years war, you did see population declines. You saw population declines during France during the Fronde. You saw population declines in England in this time period. I mean, I don't think that we escaped these kind of negative feedback loops of Malthus until the modern epoch. But I do think that there was a kind of a slow upward trend, but really the major event was 1492, the discovery of the Americas. That's really the next massive moment of expansion that becomes possible, because Europe is already militarily superior to anywhere else at this point, and this massive free real estate that leads to a huge expansion. I don't deny that, but I don't think that's quite the same thing as modernity. It's I would say the key event.
Okay, yeah, I hear what you're saying. So my difference of opinion, or difference of focus here, when I'm talking about growth of innovation, continuous growth, obviously there were wars, obviously there were pandemics and diseases,
Yes.
but even during the 14th century, there were some pretty interesting inventions that were coming out. So there was growth in human knowledge that's actually not the human norm. Like you can look at civilizations which are technologically remarkably stable for hundreds of years, and there's just no development, not even artistic development. Like it's the same exact pottery for hundreds of years. That was not the
Yes.
case in the 14th century, right? So I'm not looking. Maybe that's like an elitist perspective, but I'm saying that when you look at maybe you control for wars and disease, there's still upward growth in human knowledge, human development, human technology, military technology. I think is a pretty key focus for me. Is that
Yes.
the fact that Europeans were ready in 1492 to conquer the
Yes.
Americas
Yes.
was because of developments in the 14th century, and prior to and afterward, it was a general progression. So what I'm worried about is that this 800 years of progress, as I define it, with diseases and with plagues as well, but technological
Yeah.
progress, you know, I'm concerned of where did that come from? Because it didn't come from nowhere. It wasn't accidental. It
No.
wasn't
No.
spontaneous. It's not natural. It's not normal in human history for that to happen. So it's actually exceptional. It's a state of exception in the broad stroke of human history. So why did that happen? And our whatever generated that, and I think a lot of it has to do with human intelligence. Whatever generated that, if we are losing that source, if we're losing that seed, then we are kind of running on borrowed time. We are sort of living off this built
There
up.
has been, there has been a stagnation of inventions and innovations since around the 1970s. The greatest century of innovation is around like 1870 to 1970. Where, the point is, if you were born in 1870 or 1920, you would have lived to see absolutely everything about life completely transform from when you were born. Whereas if you're born in 1970, it's not nearly quite so true. Basically, you're entirely looking at computers and microprocessing and maybe CRISPR, if you are optimistic about CRISPR. Yeah, that's basically the major thing. I happen to think AI is a major invention. I don't think that it's like an absolutely earth-shattering, like everything in human history was building up to this point, Nick Land sort of invention, but I think it is a major invention. I think it will have a large impact. But again, my perspective is really not about technology here. I'm actually not a techno-pessimist. I'm actually not anti-technology, because technology increases efficiency, and that is an unalloyed good. It's just that so far efficiency has never made a dent in our energy consumptive nature. We found this enormous energy consumption in the beginning of the 19th century, and we've been running an absolute party ever since then. And the efficiency gains have only speeded up and accelerated the proliferation of it, it hasn't led to this kind of streamlining, dematerialization, decoupling, which the technologists have promised. However, this is, in my opinion, a human cultural problem. It's a human systems problem. You could design social media so that it had less deleterious effects upon people. The reason why the filter bubbles and the all of the negative effects of polarization, all these things which people talk about on social media, well, they exist because they make more profit. They haven't actually changed the algorithms about these things fundamentally, and because they make more profit. And there's a whole bunch of examples of technology which we could be using towards very good ends, but which we don't, because everybody is optimized, everything is Molochian, everything is controlled by either national security or stakeholder value maximization. It really, and which again, it ignores all of these. It privatizes the profits and socializes the losses in terms of externalities, which it doesn't pay for. And obviously, nobody paid for the millions of years of geological time which enabled these things to be possible. So, the technology is good. The technology could be used towards wide boundary goals like the flourishing of life in perpetuity, or the maintenance and protection of a culture which is pro-enlightenment and which is pro-future and so forth. It could be used to be doing these things in a wider boundary notion of what we should be doing, but it doesn't at the moment. And so the technology really, it could act as a kind of a softening blow, that as you start running into these kind of hard limits, well, the technology means you need less degrowth because you're more efficient. It means you need less catastrophic impact. I just think that there's no way that these people tend to be ecology blind. For example, Elon Musk thinks that you can have 100 billion people. He's talked about that. And Mark Andreessen said that we should take everybody to the energy consumption level of America and then multiply that by like 1,000. And it's like, if you actually use that much energy, then forget about the greenhouse effect, just the thermodynamic effect of heat, whenever you use energy that would be generated by that amount of energy consumption would be enough to boil the oceans, literally. There is absolutely no physical possibility for a lot of the kind of futurologies which people talk about, because they don't know physics, they don't know anything about energy, they don't know anything about ecology, which is just a problem. My critiques are purely practical. And technology in all of these things makes life a lot better. And so I'm not against technology at all. It's just that they are in control. They're controlled by entities which are not using them towards the best ends that they could be used to.
Yeah, I'm certainly not a physicist qualified to speak on whether we could boil the oceans with by multiplying energy consumption by 1,000 times or whatever. I have no clue, and I guess ultimately, there's basically two perspectives, I think, in terms of when we're dealing with technology and innovation. And I think most people, there are people who are against technology and innovation, but I think if you just say, okay, we're all for technology and innovation, how do we achieve that? There's a group of people, and you could call them abundance, you can give them whatever name you want to give them. But they believe that the best way to generate innovation is by increasing the population. And I don't see that as a necessary I've had arguments with these people, but I think that coupling those two things together, population increase with innovation, that doesn't seem to me to be like a deterministic formula. I can certainly see the argument of how in particular cases, if you
There's just way too many second, third, fourth order effects of population growth, which can be political, they can be all sorts of other things. If you go back to structural demographic theory, if you have massive population growth, then you have tons of young urban men who probably don't have enough jobs or various other things for them to be doing. And so you get the Arab Spring, or, there are so many effects of that kind of population growth. And you would need to have an absolutely optimized system at every level to streamline and accommodate all of this. And obviously, I doubt these people are taking into effect like the heritability of IQ, or like, which populations you would actually want to be growing and which ones you would not want to be doing for this. Because again, that probably, I mean, some of them will. I mean, there are some people in these groups who do, but most of them don't.
I mean, so I would be much more. I guess I call myself an anti-natalist, and people
Mhm.
get very upset because like, they think that means I'm anti-human and whatever that
Yeah.
means. And I don't have a big problem with like South Korea trying to boost its birth rate. I'm just very cynical about the attempts that have been made. And I'm also
Yeah.
cynical about the idea of, giving people a bunch of cash up front like they've won the lottery, because, I think a lot of the people who would jump at the opportunity to take cash for getting pregnant are,
Yeah.
some of the people who are short-term, thinkers, and
Yeah.
basically you're creating a eugenics program to breed a form of humanity that is more materialistic and less idealistic and sort of more calculative. And I don't know that that's a great plan, or that we should be
Yeah, I
devoting,
mean, the thing about population decline is I think that we do need to have a lower population for the planet. So, on that function, I am an antinatalist. I think that you can get if you get a sufficiently low birth rate, then as a country, then your exponential decay rate is so abysmal that like you're going to get conquered by North Korea. Like that's what would happen. Or at minimum, you'd have like an intense destabilization, because within a couple of generations, South Korea will have to have like 15% conscription in order to get like the same army size right now that they have, just to maintain where they are right now. Otherwise, they would have like a massively smaller one. And that obviously hugely changes the entire structure of your society. I mean, ideally, you would have some kind of technocratic management of the birth rate, such that didn't get too high, didn't get too low, and that it was at like a kind of like a reasonable level. I generally think that negative eugenics is much more effective than positive eugenics. That doesn't have to be some kind of like full blown psycho like version of that, in my opinion. But unfortunately, that is the case, because when you try to do positive eugenics, then there's, yeah, as you're saying, there's kind of these perverse incentive systems, and it's not so easy.
Right. I mean, there have been positive eugenic programs that didn't really work out,
Yeah.
statistically speaking. Um, so let's talk about Africa. We talked about Africa last year,
Okay.
actually, in a
Sure. Yeah.
different
No, we did.
context. Let's talk about Africa, because one of the things I'll say about your point with global antinatalism is
Mhm.
that, obviously, the the areas where it's easiest to lower, if you're trying to lower global population, then you should be targeting areas which have the highest fertility, which are all in Africa.
Mhm.
I mean, technically, I think Afghanistan has, similar levels, but that's just one
Mhm.
country. As a region, it's Africa. So you'd go to Africa, and the best way to lower fertility, in my point of view, is look at what South Africa has done, or at least what apartheid South Africa was doing, which was economic development. Now they don't really have
Yes.
economic development anymore, but I'm saying if you were able to reintroduce a model of economic development, then you theoretically could
Well,
decrease
actually, this is a
fertility.
good point, because do you know what the number one thing which is correlated with high birth rate is? I mean, more than anything
Religiousness,
else.
I would guess.
No, you're wrong. It's actually childhood mortality. The higher the childhood mortality, the higher the birth rate. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think the main things that you would want in Africa would be feminism. It would be women's liberation. and it would be introducing modern medical technology and economic development. I mean, this stuff is all way easier said than done because, in a sense, Africa is the exception. This is what's happened everywhere else, pretty much. I mean, this happened in Southeast Asia. It's happened in even India. Whereas Africa, it's the only place where, in a sense, this kind of slum world never ended. I mean, back in the day, you had like slum world was like Central America, it was South America, it was Africa, and it was even China. I mean, China absolutely had this slum world pattern, but they absolutely cracked down on it. It's gone now. That never happened in Africa. That never changed. They're still using this Creole technology. Is the term which David Edgerton used for it. But essentially, if you look at these places, they didn't follow the same trajectory as Europe, and so you can't use the same model. In like a slum in Europe meant an old, dilapidated part of town which hasn't changed very much, and people are still living in these like old flats that are like really rough. Whereas in Africa, it's the opposite. The slum is the newest. It's the newest part of the city, which people have kind of improvised together using industrial waste, basically, like whether it's plastics or rusted metals. The term bidonville, it came from bidon, which means oil drum, which was in Algeria. And so you had this explosion of the Algerian population where they're literally making their houses out of the sort of stretched out oil drums. And it's very obvious where like the imagination behind Camp of the Saints came from, where they used these busted up colonial ships to break in and invade France. Is that like it is this kind of re-territorialization of these technologies. And that's what leads to the growth, and it leads to a growth of this kind of infinitely expanding growth of high mortality, very, very depressed standard of life, but it just keeps going. And Africa, in fact, for that reason, it's the only part of the world which actually is headed towards a traditional Malthusian limit, in a pretty old school sense. And if you look at agricultural productivity, it's pretty much stagnant, whereas the population growth is exponential. And so the only reason why half of these countries haven't starved to death is because of just this huge foreign aid program. Whereas the rest of the world has not followed that trajectory. They're following the kind of, more weird, overshooty kind of Malthusianism. And yeah, I think the African solution, it's easier said than done, but there has been some progress. I mean, if you look at Ethiopia, the birth rate has declined a lot faster than anticipated, precisely because you've had Chinese investment in building basically small flats for people to live in. If you give someone a small flat, they're not going to be having like 7 kids. And this is a better standard of life for these people. It doesn't actually have to be some kind of cynical motivation. It is actually much better to live in a flat and have like 2 kids than it is to live in a fucking house made out of an oil drum and have like 7 kids that are out like, that's way worse for mode of existence. Tossing out your shit with a plastic bag. That's not great. It's very, very grim.
Right. So yeah, South Africa, I think, is the model of development. And, I'm going to publish a survey at some point of looking at sub-Saharan African populations worldwide. So specifically like the Caribbean, Haiti, Barbados, Jamaica. And, people can say, well, those are like tiny little city-states. They're not representative of these populations. But yeah, I don't think that the delay. So looking specifically at India versus Africa, I mean, India was thoroughly developed by the British Empire, and it's not just. I don't know. Maybe there's a materialist, determinist view that you create certain economic conditions and that creates certain cultural conditions. But I also think that there is a cultural aspect to westernization, modernization, globalization. We talk about feminism. I think that actually you look at what the British did in India, and they were banning women from setting themselves on fire when their husbands died. They were banning human sacrifice. They were banning these cultural religious practices. They were introducing the age of consent. So they actually did change the sexual culture of India in a pretty thorough way, in a way that was supported by some Indians, opposed by others. And I don't think that when you look at the high fertility areas in Africa, generally sub-Saharan Africa, it's not in these urban areas, which always have lower fertility. I mean, your French example notwithstanding, just in the modern day, all the African cities have lower fertility than the rural countryside. And so it's like the lack of infrastructure that's there that could be built up. The question is, what's sort of the cost benefit analysis of how much are we going to spend on foreign aid? And one of the things I would say is, just to your point about, this Malthusian limit, is that giving agricultural aid to Africa, which has been a pretty, I don't have all the numbers on it, it's a study that I should do, but all the agriculture aid we're giving to Africa is kind of perpetuating, it's sustaining a system of poor growth, as opposed to going in there building infrastructure, which is kind of what the Chinese are doing to an extent. Is they're not
Yeah.
really giving Africans food. They're building bridges and stadiums and things like that, which are probably more helpful in the long term in terms of producing growth, producing change in the way that those societies function. um, so yeah, I guess I'm optimistic about the prospect. I don't know if what Trump has done with U.S. aid is he's just said we're canceling the program.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh well, actually the program was bad because it was like a food-based program, and now we're going to focus on these other things which are more productive. It's just like, no, we don't like other countries. And the problem to me for that is that we ultimately want, in a globalized economy, we want to be able to mine lithium in Africa. We want to be able to, extract oil from Gabon. Like, we want those resources. It's a kind of in a globalized market economy, it's not like, oh, we'll just leave the Africans to to overconsume their resources and whatever, and it doesn't affect us. It's like, these are the Earth resources, right? So sequestering off one part of the planet, saying, oh, that part of the planet doesn't matter, we're just focused on America. I don't think that ultimately works. So I think we should be interested in that. I think we should be, engaged in like a technocratic management of these other countries and see their problems
Well, in a
as
sense,
our problems.
the reason why nothing ever really happens to change the status quo is because you have a conversation between third world and the first world, and what the first world should be saying to the third world is we need to get a control over this population problem. And then, of course, what the third world could then say back to the first world is that, well, you massively overconsume relative to your size. And in a sense, both of these are very awkward topics, because it's really, really difficult to convince the third worlders to stop the population growth. And it's very, very difficult to convince first worlders to give up their huge overconsumption. I mean, if you imagine like an America where they care this much about like the Second Amendment, like trying to like take over their cars and then recycle them for more efficient purposes, that's a way more difficult political sell, relatively speaking. And so, because I mean, if you tried to, I mean, America essentially consumes as if there's 3 to 4 Earths. One fridge consumes more electricity than the average sub-Saharan African does in a year. Like, there is a degree of exuberance that you couldn't possibly lift everybody in the third world up to that, because what we're doing is absolutely unsustainable. And on the other hand, the population growth there is really really bad, and so they're worse for like biodiversity. They're worse for the destruction of natural ecosystems, because if you have much more, there's much more destruction that goes on there on those bases. So it's really quite a difficult issue, because if you had to come up with a global solution to this, well, the problem is neither side is really going to agree to it. The kind of, you're never really going to get some like even stronger than Klaus Schwab, like voluntary shrinking in the West, and you're well, it's probably more easy to imagine voluntary population reduction or population growth stopping, because there's more precedent for being able to get that to go down across. Yeah, I mean, like again, like everywhere has gone down faster than people anticipated, which is a good thing, you know. Again, Alex Jones would not be very happy with me right now for saying all this. You know, my position when people say, you know, because of this kind of antinatalism, because of this overpopulation, that I'm some sort of anti-human. No, I'm in favor of more people just spread over time, not overcrowding in one particular moment. I mean, if you have a long-term view, then it's better to have more smart people having more sustainable lifetimes over a longer time span than a whole bunch of people crowded together causing problems for each other in the here and now. It's not that humanity or humans are evil or whatever.
Yeah, the statistic about the fridge consuming more energy than the African. Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess we're stuck with this predicament where, like, even if there was a political movement which said, yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to tax consumption at the source, because I think the trying to recycle things after the fact is a very, very ineffective, very inefficient. You just say, okay, well, the price of gasoline is $10 a gallon. The price of electricity, it's your electrical bill is $1,000 a month. You may basically, we're going to tax the consumption of energy at the source, and consumers can figure that out however they want to figure that out. The reaction to that from national security would be to say, okay, well, you've just collapsed the American economy. China's going to take over everything, and they're not going to respect any of that. So it really is an energy arms race between these competing powers that no one wants to unilaterally disarm. And unlike military technology, where you can build a bunch of nukes and then you can disestablish them, or you can store them. You don't have to use them. It's like when you try to maximize energy consumption, you can't take it back. You can't say, oh no, let's just take the oil out of the car and put it back into the earth or something. So I guess I feel like we don't have a choice. There's no policy levers or mechanisms that we have to limit consumption. So I basically just write it off as like a given, as an inevitability of we're going to consume more. Everyone's consuming more, and so the only part of the function that I see as malleable is the fertility aspect. And obviously, in terms of moral argumentation, does the third world like that or agree with that? I don't think it really matters. I think that if you give them money, I mean, in the way that the Chinese are doing, if you provide economic opportunities, they will take those economic opportunities, whether or not some faction believes that's colonialism or something, I think is irrelevant. It's just, you have to lay the cash on the table, and, they'll take the cash on the table. So, I think that's really the only way to deal with the problem. Obviously, that's, to your point, that doesn't make the problem go away. It doesn't solve the problem. But to the extent that you can soften the blow, that's the only way to do it. And yeah, hopefully there's some technology that comes out that gives us free infinite fusion, cold fusion reactor energy, and so on, and makes this discussion irrelevant. Yeah, so this is kind of what I've seen you post about this, and I wanted to talk about it because it's not something that I have like a certain dogmatic opinion on it. I certainly like what some abundance people say, and I'm also certainly, there's a book that I read in like 2011 called Resource Wars,
Mhm.
and it talked about the national security aspect of having a world of peak oil and
Mhm.
diminishing resources, and the fact that people aren't just going to lie down and die and say, "Oh, I guess we're not going to consume so much anymore." No, they're going to go to war with other countries and to kill people and steal their stuff to maintain their level of consumption.
Yeah.
That's what happens historically, I think, and mostly a lot of that had to do with agriculture and who had access to the grain, and now it's about energy in a broader sense.
Indeed.
But yeah, I mean, I think that pretty much gets to the heart of the issue. I don't know how much time you had today, or if there are some other things you wanted to introduce or caveats you wanted to throw out there, but those were most of my questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very likely outcome. I mean, I think that's we our politics has been so profoundly shaped by being in a period of continual abundance. I mean, all of the kind of like Roosevelt, Vannevar Bush, science, the endless frontier, this kind of belief that everyone can be lifted up, the very function of mass democracy. I mean, mass democratic politics is only intelligible, really, in a society with a gigantic energy surplus, because the reason why the center holds in a mass democracy is because, I mean, basically, the state inextricably got more complex with the rise of energy, because it means that there's more scale, there's more population, and there's more complexity in managing that system. And so the state basically rose up to about 40% of GDP, give or take, in modernity, pretty much no matter where you are. Obviously, if you're a communist, then that's gonna change things, but it pretty much got there. And what it does is it adjudicates where the surplus goes. And it's very difficult to change the system because everybody wants some form of entitlement, whether it's pensioners, whether it's people on welfare, whether it's subsidized healthcare, whether it's all of these goodies. And, the whole of the discourse is about how we get growth so that we can afford to give more of this out. And you could deficit spend, and then you can move to fiat currency, and you can use the central bank to bail people out, and you can just make the system more and more and more intense. And then on the other hand, the other aspect of it is finance, in that nobody really wants to get in the way of finance, because if you create massive levels of debt, then that massively increases the amount that you can spend in the present. Because when a bank, they give out a loan, they've just created money. That was true even when the gold standard was a thing. Most money was just private banks creating it. That's still true today. And you can create much more spending. And as long as there is a seemingly infinite supply of energy and resources, that you're never running into physical limits there, then the system can go on indefinitely. Hence why the libertarians have been crying and talking about the same issues for the last 100 years. The system, it has to come to an end. You can't keep going, but it can keep going. It can keep going indefinitely until you reach some kind of a biophysical limit on what you're doing. Because money is a claim on energy and resources. And if they're not forthcoming, then you are very much if you have a system of mass debt, and your claims can't be fulfilled because the material flows start slowing down or stopping, then you're very much in a financial Wile E. Coyote situation, which is what I think we are in fact heading towards. But yeah, I mean, mass democratic politics, it's absolutely inescapable. There is no alternative to it. I mean, I suppose a Chinese style system is possible, but it's actually quite similar in a number of ways. Um, and because communism is fundamentally a growther ideology. Marx hated Malthus. Um, it is also an infinite growth ideology. I mean, you don't need the state. The utopia is that there's so much abundance that nobody needs to. They can all be fishing and then reading philosophy. I mean, that's basically what Marx says, right? Doing whatever you want. But yeah, it's shaped by this, and this whole culture and politics that's shaped by abundance. Well, it's not a coincidence. I mean, mass democracy, it starts taking off in the 19th century. I mean, that's the exact same period as when fossil carbons come in. It fully flourishes in the 20th century, which is when the system fully embraces all of the technologies to really create this. And yeah, I think it's going to be at an end by this century, because I don't see how you can deal with scarcity outside of authoritarianism. I think that you go back to the historical norm. If people are complaining about declining standards of living, then you just have to beat them up, pretty much. And again, if you have this kind of intense geopolitical competition over this declining share, again, it's very difficult to have a serious war without very serious authoritarianism as well. But yeah, I think that is the trajectory of where things are headed. I mean, my default assumption is electrofeudalism. Is some kind of electrofeudalism as my default null hypothesis for the outcome, in the sense that you'll get an elite which knows how the electrical technology works and which everything is scaled down, but they have a monopoly on it, and everyone else is out working, doing yard work, regenerative agriculture, like really menial shit. I mean, that's my null hypothesis. I could be wrong, but that is my default assumption for how this kind of pans out. And it probably does mean more geopolitical conflict. It probably does mean the end of mass democracy. But those are my general assumptions. It could be something entirely different. We don't know, because we've never actually faced this sort of situation before. We've never had globalism before. We've never had this sort of energy surplus. We've never had these kind of populations. I mean, it's all very, very recent, It's all we've had 10,000 generations of agriculture. We've had like 10 generations of modern techno-industrial civilization.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess my optimism, I don't know if this is an optimistic thing to say, but from my perspective, it's like, I think we race to that 2 billion number, or, people disagree exactly what it is, but let's say it's 2 billion. We race to that as soon as possible, and we find ways to deal with the consequences of that race. So as you described, you have a huge security problem if you don't have any young men to staff, your military, because then, how are you going to defend your country? You have a huge social security problem because all these pensioners, they need food, they need water, they need a living space. So how do you deal with all of that? I mean, I think I call it neoliberal Stalinism is my term, because as you noted, unfortunately for the communists who think that, communism is an authoritarian system that controls the population, it's technocratic, but communism relies on the kind of democratic logic of infinite growth, and people don't realize how fragile these communist regimes are. I mean, look at the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union was delivering actual economic growth, yes, it had gulags, it had all those terrible things, but the Soviet Union had real economic and technological growth. And when that started to slow, you actually had people like Anatoly Chubais, who was a neoliberal libertarian within the Soviet system, who conspired to bring the system down with Yeltsin and Putin and these others. So these are fragile systems without infinite growth. So I actually don't see communism as a solution to this, and so I call it neoliberal Stalinism, because basically it's saying like, we're going to use Stalinist tactics, so we're going to put people in gulags, but it's not for the purpose of getting everyone a job and getting everyone on welfare and that sort of thing. It's for the purpose of
mass
running
democracy.
The economy.
Mass democracy is a better, more stable system of having a huge energy surplus, because it allows for a much easier risk-free circulation of elites compared to communism. They always have immense difficulty with succession. That's always been a messy issue. And like they were just clearly incompetent relative to their neighbors in Eastern Europe, which was the main reason why all of those states collapsed. But yeah, I mean, I don't think either system really makes it, because they're both abundance-brained systems, and that's not really what the future is, in my opinion.
Well, we'll see. We'll see how quickly these things develop. I mean, I still think that I guess I would put like a 20-year time horizon before any of these issues become visible to the general public. I don't know. Do you have a
Yeah.
like do you feel like we've already passed sort of, peak abundance and we're now entering scarcity? What are your sort of time
Oh
horizons?
yeah, I think we are entering scarcity now. Um, it's I think that we will have massive fiscal problems first. Because, I mean, think of it this way, like, if you are going to the top of like Mount Everest and you've got like maybe 10%, 20% less oxygen, it's suddenly way more difficult for everything to work. And so if you just get like a little bit of a constriction or a slowdown of the energy which enters the system, it has quite a disproportionate effect. I mean, I think peak oil in America is probably, this time for realsies, is like 5 years, 5 years, 10 years at the absolute max in America. And whoever that hits, it's not going to be very good. But you can kind of offset that maybe with imports, but it's happening relatively soon. I think it will unfold over a series of tipping points, but it's kind of like, I think that we will kind of know that we're in an age of scarcity not very far in the future. I mean, I think there's already issues bubbling to the surface there. Obviously, geopolitics would massively speed everything up. Like, it could easily speed everything up. I mean, like, Israel is actually not blowing up the sort of Hormuz, like, Iranian infrastructure there. They've been blowing up the oil and gas depots for domestic consumption in Iran, and so they've not actually disrupted its exports. So I think that the Israelis are not trying to like fuck up the entire system, because I mean, if they actually did blow up like the Iranian ability to export oil, then like Japan would immediately be in like very deep trouble, for example.
Yeah,
And if the Japanese crashed, then that would affect everyone.
yeah, I mean, to me, like when you talk about peak oil, and I'm open-minded to the idea of peak oil.
Mhm.
Um, but and again, I'm skeptical of all these green technologies, but in terms of
Yeah.
like actual peak energy consumption, I think that
Mhm.
will there is a lag where even if you hit peak oil, you still
Mhm.
you can still mine more lithium, you can still build more nuclear power plants, and I so that's why I say 20 years. But I think to
Well,
your point,
nuclear power. I mean, nuclear power is just so overhyped. I mean, if you quadrupled the amount of nuclear power plants that you built a year, and so you were building like 30 nuclear power plants a year, by 2050, you'd have doubled nuclear power from like 2 to 4% of global energy use. Like, we currently use more wood for power than nuclear. And like, I'm not against nuclear. It's just that it's cumbersome, it's slow. It will take quite a long time to get like Gen 3 plus or Gen 4 meaningfully in the grid. Um, the like solar, it's the same thing. I mean, if you wanted to get solar from like 4% to like 50%, like that's just a gigantic undertaking. And again, the power density is not, it's not nearly as good. And again, electricity in general is only 20% of global energy use. It's only 20% is electricity. And whereas if you look at solar and nuclear, these are all electricity. Whereas, like, your combine harvesters and your trucks and your ships and your aviation and your mining technology. I mean, these things are all diesel. I mean, they're all basically diesel. Well, actually, well, jet fuel in the case of aviation, but there's no obvious alternative to these things.
No, that's true. That's true. That you need liquid fuel. The batteries are not good. The batteries are
Yeah.
expensive. The batteries are not, in fact, renewable,
Nope.
and they're not recyclable. And so there's a bit. What you're saying there is true. I'm just saying that, like, I'm optimistic in thinking that we can go 20. Like, basically, I'm saying by 2045
Yeah.
there's going to be a news story that comes out that says, hey, the globe consumed less energy this year than we did the previous year for the first time in however many centuries or something. And that's going to be a big shock, obviously, to economies and geopolitically. But I think what could speed that up, and this is like the pessimistic view you're talking about, the Strait of Hormuz, is that all of this global energy consumption doesn't just require technical expertise. It doesn't just
Yes.
require, an abundance mindset or neoliberalism or communism. It requires geopolitical cohesion, peace
Yes.
treaties. It requires that Israel doesn't, nuke Iran and these sort of things, which, for the present moment, I don't know what you think is going on in the Middle East. I don't know what's going on in the Middle East, but maybe for the present moment, okay, India doesn't go to war with Pakistan, Iran, Israel, it's fake news, whatever. It's like we're keeping things stable for the moment, but I think that everybody's saying Taiwan in 2027. That's going to be the invasion date. I don't know if that's
I don't
true,
think so.
but
But
I
yeah.
mean, I think that there is this in terms of cycles, right? We talk about the cycles of energy, population.
Yeah.
Talking about cycles of war, that seems like you never have, you can't sustain like 100 years of peace indefinitely. Like that doesn't historically occur, and also it's not really a function of intelligence. It's not like, oh, if we just educate every people and make them all smarter and development or whatever, then war goes away. I don't think that's a solution either. I think it does come down to, like, the only solution would be some sort of global governance. We don't have that, and in fact,
No.
what's happened in Ukraine, what's happened in Israel, is a
Mhm.
degradation of the authority of the United Nations, because
Absolutely.
they keep putting out these pronouncements. Oh, Russia's out of SWIFT. Oh, even Swiss neutrality is gone. And, oh, we condemn the genocide in Gaza. And it all just is totally meaningless. And if you give enough warnings, enough time, and they all turn out to be ineffectual, people stop listening to you. Those
Yeah.
institutions stop working. And inevitably, you get some kind of Mussolini and Abyssinia moment where someone just says, well, fuck the UN. We're just going to do whatever we want. And then everyone just realizes that this whole international rules-based order thing was a big bluff by the United States, that they can't actually maintain it. And I'd like that bluff to go on for as long as possible. I'd like for people to keep getting fooled to think that the United States has control over the situation, which it does not. And other people, I see a lot of the anti-NATO people saying, no, we got to tear it all down immediately. Like, let's get out of NATO. Let's, like, collapse the system as soon as possible. And it's like, that's going to have real energy consequences. Like, you're not
Oh
going
yeah.
to be able to keep your refrigerator on anymore if we
No.
don't have NATO effectively.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's all absolutely true. I mean, it's a real predicament. I mean, if you have a complex, I mean, the size of an organism, its energy consumption, its metabolism, and its complexity are all tied together. And so we have a very large, complex, and energy hungry superorganism, which is the globe. But because of its complexity, it means that you have this interdependence of everyone upon everyone. And so if anyone disrupts that system, then it's a disaster for everyone. And that's what nationalists are not really acknowledging. But the problem is, I think a lot of the sort of, whatever you want to call them, globalists, they kind of believe their own bullshit, which obviously makes the system work better. But if people keep defecting and keep sabotaging, then yes, it does break it. And if it does break, that's really, really bad for everyone. And I mean, it's just it is this kind of internet like nihilism where you just want something to happen, because you're just that antisocial, and it just is what it is. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation as to why people are like that, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely people are like that. And there is something, I mean, you know, we haven't spoken about this yet, which is the sort of Peter Turchin. And apparently he's like
Yeah.
an evil man. He's like, you're not allowed to say his name. He's Voldemort or something. But
Oh, really?
um, well, among the abundance people, you're not.
Oh, okay.
Apparently, that's the name you must never speak. But look,
Huh.
I look at him as kind of a neo-Spenglerian, and of course, there's something like mystical and spiritual anytime you try to apply a biological model to civilizations and cultures, and then justify it with mathematics. But I think just putting the cycles and the math aside, just focusing on this issue of what is, and I don't even like the term, I'm just going to say, I don't like the term elite overproduction because I don't like the term elite human capital. I think,
Right. Yeah.
I think really it's bureaucratic overproduction. It's saying, everyone's going to have a college degree, everyone's going to have a middle class job, everyone's going to have the refrigerator running 24/7,
Yep.
and we can all be middle class. We can all be bureaucrats. We can all have Zoom, Excel spreadsheet jobs. And there are people who graduate from college and they realize that's not true. They
No,
feel
it's not.
let down, and then they're like, "Yeah, let's blow up NATO. Let's blow up the Middle East, or something." That seems to speak to some kind of deeper, human psychology of, I didn't get what I wanted. Now I'm going to throw a temper tantrum and have a civil war
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
something. I don't know that those people are organized and effective enough to make anything happen in that way. And I guess we have examples: the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, where there were
Mhm.
disaffected intelligentsia. They were educated, but they didn't have a sufficient goodies or credentials in the government, and so they became Bolsheviks, they became radicals, they became Freemasons. They decided to overthrow the government. In both of those cases, although from a human perspective, obviously French Revolution killed people, the Bolshevik Revolution killed millions of people, but from the perspective of the state apparatus, those revolutions, the French Revolution didn't destroy the geopolitical significance of Russia or France. Those
No.
states maintained their power and regional dominance, and you could argue it actually enhanced their power.
Yeah, it
So,
did.
what would that look like, in the Western world? Do you think there is a particular EU versus America? Do you think one is more vulnerable to the other? What do you think that looks like? And does that correspond with your time scale as far as, the next 5 or 10 years, we hit some kind of abundance threshold, degrowth becomes a reality? Is that sort of the
Yeah.
trigger effect for a political revolution, and
Hmm.
that leads to that techno electro feudalism or something like that? Where do you
Yeah.
think that happens?
The EU is in well, it's in a worse position than America, because the EU has way fewer resources than America. I mean, just straight up, like we have to import pretty much all of our energy. I mean, for the most part, unless you're like Iceland. But whereas America, I mean, they're dependent on the global system, but they have way more leverage, way more leeway than we do. I mean, in a way, this kind of contributes to the sort of like abundance is a movement in America and not Europe, really, for a reason. Like Americans can believe in something like that because they're genuinely used to it, whereas here we've really, really been struggling with chronically low growth. I mean, if you look at any of the plans to sort of revitalize Europe, like the Mario Draghi plan and whatnot, and you get to the energy section and they kind of just give these sort of waffle about green energy and it's not really satisfying. It's not really convincing for how it happens. So I think the EU is in a worse place than America for when this happens, because like if the fiscal situation gets really bad and we don't have the purchasing power, and other places are wanting to use their resources rather than sell them, like Europe is kind of the first place that gets hit. So Europe is in a way ground zero. Whereas I think in America, you're going to have a sort of a drawn out cultural battle with people who refuse to even accept that it's a reality. Like in America, you have so much kind of anti-Malthusian conspiracy culture going back to like the 1970s. Like it's remarkable. I mean, everyone hates Malthus. Like Kantbot hates Malthus. Like they all hate Klaus Schwab. The Republican Party doesn't believe that any of these issues are real. They think it's
You're
some
just
kind
trying
of
to make me live in a pod and eat bugs.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know, it's like an inversion of the communist idea that, like, oh, the
yes,
capitalists are just hoarding all the wealth and they just need to give it out to everybody. I mean, it's the same kind of
yes,
populist ideas that,
it
you know,
is, yes,
secretly there's infinite wealth and the elites are just hoarding it and they're trying to, you know, it's like, has anyone stopped to think, well, why do you think Klaus Schwab wants you to eat the bugs and live in the pod? Maybe it's because we're running out of, you know,
yeah.
resources or something. But that never, no, it's just because they hate us and they're Jewish and they want to kill the
Yeah,
goyim or something.
obviously, if you go on social media, you're going to get way more likes and retweets and shares of that compared to like in Britain. Like, I mean, I think that a huge function of Britain's decline was just geological. Like in 1999, we were digging up 31 million tons of coal. We were one of major natural gas exporter. We had 2.9 million barrels of oil a day. I mean, pretty much all of that is over, at least to, massively reduced in scale. That wasn't really a conspiracy. It kind of just happened. Like BP and all these different companies, they weren't somehow like conspiring for this to happen. It just did. Very much, but that's not very interesting. It's not very satisfying. It just happens. And I think that in America, it's going to be like in Europe, the situation's worse, and we're going to have to wake up to reality first. In America, the situation is less bad, but like the delusion is going to be very hard to get over. I think that there's going to be decades of cultural chaos. I don't really like to predict civil war because the asymmetry between like military forces and like civilians has never been greater in terms of like who has more power than the other. And I just don't. And again, if we have such a complex system that like you can't just take over a couple of institutions and then have control over any country. I just don't see it happening. I think that you will see increasing political destabilization, which is that's just what's been happening already. But you'll see more of it, and the outcome I have no idea. So.
Well, let me pose it like this. So let's put aside the question of civil war, but let's
Yeah.
talk about the most extreme example of political radicalism in Europe, I think, in the
Mm-hmm.
last, really since the Second World War, was the Golden Dawn in Greece. I think that was the
Yeah.
most radical, popular. I think they got 10 to 14% of the vote at one point, and they were like, they had to throw them in jail, basically. I mean, it was a
Yeah.
radical party. And, there are other, maybe you could argue, similarly radical parties. They just never reached that threshold of
No.
popularity. So that's one model of political destabilization, is that you get some kind of radical party. Maybe it's the AFD, the Front National, whatever people think is subjectively if those are radical or not. But you could get the growth of that kind of party that takes over the state and then implements these kind of authoritarian reforms that are just forced by necessity. The
Mm-hmm.
other model of this, and I personally think this sounds more likely to me, but the other model would be to say that you have a kind of COVID Fauci dictatorship thing where there
Mm-hmm.
is, call it neoliberal, deep state, whatever, but it's from within the establishment, from within academia. You get kind of a junta that forms of elites who say, you know what, the system is on the brink of collapse. We need to suspend democracy. And so, you know, in the American context, it's sort of January 6th versus Fauci. I'm sure
Yeah. Oh,
Europe has that same dichotomy, left
oh
versus
yeah, we
right.
do. That's 100%. Yeah.
So I guess that's what we're predicting. In the next 10 to 20 years, you can expect the EU to be run by, with an iron fist by von der Leyen, whatever her name is.
Yeah.
She's gonna be whatever. Angela Merkel's gonna be ruling Europe and telling everybody to eat the bugs and live in the pod and so on. But yeah, I mean, I'm not convinced um, because I'm not a physicist, I'm not a
Hmm.
geologist.
Hmm.
I don't know all of the material facts, but I think
Hmm.
it's interesting to think about as a possibility. And certainly, I think even the abundance people who listen to me will agree that if we don't have solid global geopolitics, even if we have infinite oil and infinite lithium and nuclear power and all those things, if we don't have a globalized economy, it all comes crashing down anyway. I mean, there's no way to keep the
I
growth
mean, to
going.
me, just to kind of wrap up the conversation, there are certain kind of counterfactuals which I'm willing to entertain, and other ones which I'm not. And I can't imagine the possibility that we extend the carbon pulse significantly via some massive new discoveries of XYZ somewhere. And, that's possible. I mean, I don't think it's likely. There's not been a year since like 1984 where there's been more oil discoveries than stuff used, but, it's been a long time. Um, but I can say okay, like the resource constraints aren't going to be so much of an issue due to efficiency gains and a few big discoveries. Like that's possible. I don't think it's likely, but it is possible. What I really don't think is possible in any scenario is that the current levels of population and consumption, because of how far they are, like over various kind of planetary thresholds, that you're not living in basically a really depressing dystopia by the mid to late of this century. Um, and so to me, it's like you either have simplification, I mean, not necessarily collapse, but a simplification of the global system due to resource limits, or you maintain a current level of complexity, but in a very heavily degraded planet, which is very, very bleak. And there's a lot of refugees being moved around and stuff like that. Because I think that the science on that is just very, very solid. So I mean, I think those are really your like it's the sort of like the Planet of the Humans documentary where it's like, well, actually, the idea that there isn't some kind of like massive hurdle to this infinite growth is kind of even more terrifying to contemplate than than there being a hard break at some point.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to leave it there. I mean, this has
Yeah.
introduced a lot of ideas and things to chew on and things to really. I mean, there are empirical questions that I don't think have been thoroughly examined enough, and I don't think. And look, there's one side that's right and one side that's wrong, and
Yes.
and that's a debate that should be had. And people who are upset maybe by the conversation we're having, I think it's on you have a responsibility. Okay, convince, use evidence, convince, explain why what you think is wrong here. But I think it's an important debate to be having. And so I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you
Yeah.
spending the time. We'll definitely have to get this out soon because otherwise, everything we say about Israel and Iran is going to be wrong by tomorrow.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
we have to get it out before it becomes irrelevant. But no, I appreciate it.
That's true.
Philip Burdau, Zoomer Schopenhauer, thanks for coming on again.
Cheers.
All right, cheers. Bye bye.